So with that said, we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, this webinar is Global Talent Mobility, the Workforce Imperative. We're really thrilled to be joined by three excellent participants on this webinar today. We have Lisa Rowan, who is the Research Vice President for IDC, responsible for global research on human capital and talent management software and services. Ms. Rowan provides expert analysis focused on both the business, services, and software used to address HR and talent-related dimensions. Also joining us this morning, we have Kristy Milock, who is the Manager of International Assignment Services at Raytheon Company. Her team provides support to all of Raytheon's US outbound expatriate employees. And then last but not least, we have Steve Black. Since co-founding Topia in 2011, Steve has been there to see the company grow from a small London-based startup to an award-winning global talent mobility platform, supporting organizations around the world. At Topia, Steve leads our strategic initiatives, leveraging deep industry and customer insight. So I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. And just real quick, I want to take a moment to acknowledge and appreciate that this is a time of uncertainty, and it's quite demanding for many folks, particularly those in mobility. So we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. And we're looking forward to a great discussion as part of this webinar. And also, are open and welcome your questions related to the topics that are of interest to you as we go throughout this presentation. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Lisa, who will kick us off, and also will be leading our discussion later on. Lisa?
Thank you, Sean, and welcome, Kristy and Steve. I really am very pleased to talk with you all today, and I'll add my good wishes to Sean's. I hope that as you hear us either live or on recording, that you and your families are doing well, and that know that we are all pulling together to get through this current crisis. So I'm going to take a few minutes here to kind of set the table, if you will. And, first up, what is global talent mobility? Well, it really is managing a global workforce and all of the facets associated with managing a globally dispersed workforce and making sure that you can get people in the various geographies of the world, whether in country or cross border, get the right people in the right seats when you need them. And so, there are other facets to global talent mobility. There are benefits almost too numerous to mention. And once our economy and our current crisis is behind us, and we all hope for that to be quicker than later, we will again go back to business as usual. And we're going to be looking to find the right talent where it's needed and when it's needed most. And some of the benefits, as I mentioned, it gives your workforce a chance to gain global experience. And, as a byproduct of that, it helps to retain the workforce because you're seen as a company that truly does offer opportunities, whether they be cross-country or, as I said, cross-border. And it benefits you as an enterprise, you as an employer, by giving you a broader talent pool from which to hire, rather than always looking in country or locally, wherever it might be. This gives you the opportunity to do more inward and upward mobility within the organization. So, Sean, you could pop up our next slide. And, the question here, why now? Well, I'll start with the bottom bullet. I don't know how many of you many years ago read Thomas Friedman's kind of landmark book about the world being flat, but indeed, the world has flattened, and we are really, a global, interconnected workforce, workplace, whatever. So, what are the drivers today and in the future for global talent mobility? Well, there is an overarching drive for geographic expansion. And as a result of that, there is a war for talent out there. There is not just local competition for talent, but globally difficult competition for talent. There is a present and future shift in required skills. As we modernize our technologies and we bring in a robotic process automation, machine learning, and all of those technical skills, those are in short supply depending upon where you are in the US or Canada or throughout the world. So there's a shift there. So it could be that you need to move different skills around the globe. And the last bullet here, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes, are the generational demands that are being placed on employers like you for choice and demand for international experience. And so, Sean, we could maybe go to our next slide and talk about, global talent mobility, and the numbers tell the story. Now, on the left, we've got the U.S. unemployment rate over the last 10 years. It's reached a 50-year low. This is temporarily going to pop back up, but as of the end of 2019, it stood at 3.5% in the U.S. But there are other, different numbers that contribute to the drive for global talent mobility. At the top here, by 2025, just 5 years down the road, 75% of the workforce will be from the millennial generation. And we've all talked perhaps too much about the needs that millennials place on the workforce, but they are a different work style than the folks that have come before. So we need to be everly mindful of that. Number two here and number three are a couple of different pieces of information. First, out of McKinsey, that the global mobile workforce really grew from 1.52 to 1.88 million in from 2017 projections to 2023. And Finaccord forecasts by next year, 2021, the number of expats will reach approximately 87.5 million, and that's a 32% increase from 2017. So we see that the momentum and the exponential growth in global movement is going to continue. And so we can go to our next slide, Sean. So what are some of the challenges that companies face when it comes to implementation of global talent programs? There's a couple of here, and they're typically tied to the technology and systems in place. You may have an older or more mature legacy set of systems that don't give you that transparent global view of the workforce. You may be using X system in the US, Y system in France, Z system in Japan. And so there isn't any way that you can easily bring that all together under a single view that allows you that global visibility into your talent. It can be very difficult even to ascertain a worldwide headcount because of the different systems in place. Now, along with that, what we see is that these systems typically are low on the digital readiness scale, so they're not really fully modernized. There are a lot of manual interventions and human error that can be introduced. And as a result of all of that, what we see is there isn't one single source of data truth. Data is locked up in all of these different silos that are disconnected from one another. So Sean, I think my last slide here, and I've talked about a couple of things already here, but global talent mobility, it does give organizations that embrace it a competitive edge in a number of areas, and I'll just cite a couple of them here. Number one, talent acquisition. Global mobility program gives an employer a sense of a culture that allows them to attract the right talent. It's demonstrating that the employer, in this case you, are forward thinking and you're encouraging innovation. And then talent development, well, global mobility provides development opportunities. So you are by giving people the opportunity to relocate to, go overseas, what have you, or come here from other parts of the world, you're giving them development opportunities they wouldn't otherwise have. And last but not least, going hand in hand with talent acquisition and development of your talent is retention. A positive global mobility experience really does minimize voluntary turnover, and it heightens and increases the level of talent retention. And so at this point, I think, Sean, are you going to introduce Steve, or would you like me to introduce Steve?
We can just, you can go ahead and introduce Steve, Lisa. Thank you.
Okay, well, it's my pleasure to introduce Steve Black, founder of Topia, and he's going to talk through something that Topia has developed that will help you and help other organizations kind of do an assessment about your global talent mobility readiness. So, Steve?
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Lisa. And folks listening, that was a very abridged version by Lisa of a recent white paper that she published on the importance of global mobility and the increasing strategic nature of the sort of world that most of the folks on the line know all too well. So I think Sean will share a link to that white paper after today's webinar, and certainly would highly suggest checking it out. So I think, given the shift that we're undergoing, and that Lisa talked about there, of global talent mobility from what has historically been often an operational part of the business to a much more strategic one, the need for organizations to have a clear plan of attack is critical. And that's why we launched the Global Talent Mobility Assessment Framework that Lisa mentioned. And it really is serving as a way for companies to better talk about where they are today in terms of maturity of their talent mobility programs, where they want to be in the future, and how to start planning to get there. And the first question, as we have on the slide here, that I always get is, that's great, but where do I start? It's often I understand it, Steve. You're preaching to the choir here. I know we have to be great at talent mobility. I can already see us losing key staff when we can't give them the opportunities, or perhaps they have a unsatisfactory mobility experience. But frankly, folks often aren't sure where to start, and one of the big hurdles is getting the company bought in behind that needed change. And I think about it really across two key dimensions. The first being start simply. So we've all heard the old adage of the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step, and that holds true here. It can often seem so daunting to get from where we are today to where we want to get to that we end up in this sort of analysis paralysis world where we never get started. But I think it's about starting simply, and secondly, it's critical to understand where you're starting from. And in order to establish that baseline really as the first step, we typically find that when you assess the current state of your mobility program, you'll get very mixed views cross-functionally. But that's very telling and critical to understand early on. You need, of course, the perspectives of the current mobility team. They'll know better than anyone the areas where things are working well and where things need improvement. But it's also really important to take the temperature of the rest of the business, of the relocating employees, as well as your suppliers. You'll often find some very insightful anecdotes and insights come out of those conversations. And by triangulating the feedback against all those data points, that really starts to allow you to hone in on that baseline. And you need to do this in a structured fashion. And it's important because that structure then allows you to build that honest baseline, but then also build a plan of attack and track your progress against that plan in this key structure. And that's where this framework, this global talent mobility assessment, which we've touched on, really comes into play. And so this is a framework we've developed over the years of conversations with folks inside and outside of mobility, and really hinges around four key components that cover the breadth of what's needed to deliver a mobility is a key part of talent strategy. So the first piece of the puzzle is operational efficiency. Simply it covers how efficient your program is end to end. The level of process automation, the amount of manual data collection and data entry, as Lisa touched on earlier, the level of rework, frankly, that happens across internal teams and external teams. Efficiency isn't always just about what's in your business, but also in the businesses you're partnering with. And it, importantly considers the use of technology and the level of automation of basic repetitive tasks that are happening. The next piece of the puzzle or pillar of the model is data maturity. So this is a mixture of how much data do you have accessible, right? And importantly, how confident are you in that data? So I've heard folks talk about a lot of data that they don't trust, which is just as good as no data at all in many cases. And then importantly, once you start to build that baseline of data, how are you using it? Sometimes it's to tell us what we did last year or last quarter. Sometimes it's taking it a step further and looking at the so what behind that, or what was maybe the ROI or the impact of some of those changes. And then I think the third stage of that data journey is really how do we use it to help us understand what we should do? So predictive outcomes of potential assignments or modeling out different scenarios of policy changes. The third piece of the puzzle then is compliance management. So do you have visibility and access to the information needed to understand all of your compliance risks, whether that's PE risk, immigration, tax, or otherwise? And where do you stand on the spectrum of one end being able to prevent issues and compliance breaches from occurring, or at the other end reacting after the fact? And I think we've all had, we personally went through a UK Home Office audit last year. There's nothing quite like the feeling in your stomach when you open that letter from a government body saying they're coming in to do an audit. I think it's something we all want to avoid, but also we certainly want to be prepared when it does happen. And then the last piece of the puzzle, but certainly one of the most important, is around the employee experience. And I think importantly here, it's not just about the relocating employees themselves, though that's critical, of course, but it's also about the rest of your business. Does the mobility team have access to technology they need to deliver a great experience downstream to others? Do the users across your business, whether it's an HRBP, a line manager, a C-suite executive, have the self-service tools for planning, for forecasting, for getting updates? And ultimately, how does that impact the experience that you're delivering to relocating employees before, during, after a move? Or to some of the broader talent points that Lisa made earlier, what about folks that are considering a move? How are they, if at all, interacting with the mobility function? And I think by going through a structured process to assess where you are against each of these four pillars, you can start then to galvanize an understanding around the organization of where you are today. And importantly, then that transitions to a pretty honest discussion around what your aspirations are and where do you want to be tomorrow. And this alignment around the aspiration is as critical a step as the baseline piece of the puzzle as well. So I think it's interesting as we've gone through dozens of these conversations with organizations, and you think across those four dimensions that we just discussed, not everybody wants to be in the upper right-hand leading quadrant across the board. Sometimes it's around company culture, sometimes it's around priorities, but oftentimes it's about where they're starting from. So in this example on screen, if you take an organization that today may be at the bottom end of the maturity scale and are in highly reactive mode, if they try and put a plan together to the business, internal stakeholders or external, that shows we're going to go from highly reactive to world-class overnight, nobody's going to buy into the ability to deliver against that, right? And oftentimes I've seen projects fail to get funding, or technology and investments fail to get the budget because the believability of the plan and achieving that goal was unrealistic. Whereas for me, it's about that, that journey of 1,000 miles, as I touched on earlier, starting to build the plan and then build the cadence against that plan to start to take those steps for improvement, so that 2 years from now, you've made a significant demonstrable improvement, and then you can plan the next phase of the journey and beyond. And I think the exciting thing for teams today that live and breathe the world of mobility is that, as Lisa mentioned earlier, talent is an incredibly hot topic in organizations, right? It's in the top few points on the agenda of every C-suite executive. And I think there's a real opportunity, and where I've seen organizations be very successful in driving mobility transformation, is latching onto that opportunity and tying corporate talent initiatives to the change that needs to happen within mobility. And by bringing those two together, you'll be surprised at the level of support and engagement you can get from the rest of the business. So I appreciate that was a whirlwind stop through the framework that we use to help organizations understand where they are today and plan where they want to go tomorrow. But hopefully that's at least given a little bit of perspective on how you can start thinking about assessing where you are today, planning the journey ahead. We've got some great tools on the website, and it's a conversation I love to have to share some best practice and learning. So as always with these things, open for follow-up discussion and Q&A coming later in today's conversation. So with that, I will hand it back over to Lisa.
Terrific. Thank you, Steve. Well, at this point, we're going to convert over to our roundtable discussion, which I've really been looking forward to. And I wanted to, again, introduce Kristy Milock. And Kristi is with Raytheon. And, they're a very, very well-known company. But I would like to invite Kristi to tell us a little bit about Raytheon and about her role there. Kristi?
Hi, thank you, Lisa. So my role at Raytheon is I manage the team that takes care of our U.S. Outbound expatriate employees. So our focus is taking care of the pre-deployment, sustainment, and repatriation activities for those employees that are on short and long-term assignments overseas. So that's our main focus on my team. We do have folks, like it says on the slide here, globally in over 60 countries and all 7 continents, which, yes, that includes Antarctica, by the way. But we have also at Raytheon, we have a mixture of pockets where we do have local nationals, third country nationals working alongside those U.S. expatriate employees, as well as sites that have just the locals working. My team, on average, we handle 3,500 moves per year. I just call it that as I take the numbers of deployments, meaning people relocating and then people returning home. So that's approximately 3,500. And my team, just to give you perspective, is 13 people. One piece of news that we're dealing with right now is Raytheon and a company called United Technologies Corporation are set to merge in April, just like a week and a half. And so we're looking forward to that, and that will bring even more synergies and more complexities to how we work. As UTC is a more global presence and more on the commercial side. And I did want to kind of pat ourselves on the back a little bit that we have been ranked Fortune magazine's #1 most admired aerospace and defense company in 2020, and UTC, who we're merging with, was ranked #3. So that was kind of the first time that we got that ranking. So we're proud of that.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Kristi.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, let's just talk a little bit about the fact that we've been talking about how talent mobility is becoming more strategic. Kristi, in your case, can you talk a little bit about and share some examples of the ways global talent mobility has been supporting Raytheon's talent strategy?
Absolutely. So one of the, our key business and our key needs is the STEM talent, which we all know and we've heard that, that's difficult to find, is the engineering, math, technology, that type of talent. So some of the things that we have done in Raytheon is looking at how do we grow that talent from our communities. So we have different events that we have where we partner with the Girl Scouts and the Boy Scouts to kind of grow it, you know, at the children stage through high schools and colleges. We have different internships programs that we have with different colleges, but we don't only do that in the United States. We also have an international internship program as well in several key countries that we work in. So that's where we work with foreign nationals in their home country and also rotate them to the United States so that they have that cycle of learning and the Raytheon way in the US as well as in their home country. So we have several years of that internship programs in both locations. We're now, it's kind of a new thing, we're in our 3rd year of our Poland internship, and our 2nd year is for Saudi Arabia and UAE. But we're really, you know, just trying to get involved in the community to gain that excitement in those skills, because that's what we desperately need to continue success in our business.
Yeah, I talked about that a bit. The STEM skill sets are very difficult to find. Sounds like you are pursuing somewhat of a kind of building up that farm team from the grassroots. So that's really terrific. Yeah. You know, how do you see that changing? Or obviously we're in a bit of a crisis that we hope is temporary, but how do you see that changing and continuing in the future? Kind of your program, the way it stands today.
Well, I see that, you know, we have to, and we are, you know, evolving to changing with how the generations are changing. You know, we've been working in the past to the current generation X and moving to the millennials and Generation Z to adapt the way that we work, the way our offices are structured, the way that we're looking at talent, and to see how we can become more flexible, you know, because Raytheon does somewhat have a reputation of being very rigid, and that's one of the things that we're trying to change that, to become, you know, more flexible in the way that we work and the way that we just structure ourselves, even within the office space and things like that. One of the key synergies that we feel with merging with UTC is that they have, like I mentioned earlier, more of a global presence. They're more, where Raytheon's more on the defense contracting, government contracts with some commercial. They're heavier on the commercial side, so they have a lot of experience globally in these pockets in different countries of really dealing with the local markets. So we're looking to leverage that with the UTC partners when we come together to really expand and see what other talent is out there locally that we may be missing now.
Sure. Yeah. Now, have you any, I loved your story about, you know, scouting and starting with a very young audience. Beyond that, any other kind of wins or key benefits that you've seen as a result of your global mobility program?
Well, part of the key wins and benefits, so another aspect of what we've been doing with some of the talent is we have a couple of different things. We have a leadership development program where we send different functional leaders to different countries to gain experience on like a short-term assignment. So we send those folks to gain that international experience and bring that knowledge and expertise back to a position in the United States to leverage and share that knowledge and experience with the folks in the different pockets in the United States or in a different foreign location if that's where they choose to go. We also have that program that I mentioned earlier with the international internship program, where we also have an international leadership development program as well, to where we were taking the local foreign national employees that we see this talent and rotating them to different locations to also share those experiences as well. Another program that we have to try to help incentivize talent to not only learn from the experiences, but to keep the talent once they do, is we have what we call a Repatriation Plus program. And that is where we essentially say to certain key roles, you know, if you agree to take this assignment for a year or two, then we have a place for you when you come back. And that might sound foreign to a lot of people on the phone, because you might always have a job for people when they come back, but because we're so contract-based at Raytheon, we have a lot of government contracts that not every person is necessarily feels secure that they have a job back where they came from. We have to have an extra incentive for some of these key talent roles to say, all right, we're going to mentor you, we're going to sign you up with a sponsor. HR is going to work with you and your sponsor to develop you while you're overseas and learn these skills. And when you come back in a year or two, then we're going to help place you in a role that you are interested in back in the United States when you're ready to come back. So we have implemented that to keep this talent and not let that go to another company.
That's terrific, Kristi. A lot of bi-directionality. I think that's a very important point.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Steve, what do you see are the biggest blockers that are preventing talent mobility from kind of delivering on the strategic aspirations we've been talking about?
Yeah, it's a good one. I think I often see, right, the mobility team can see the trends, they can see what's happening, and they're sort of fighting for the change. I think, what we've seen is this mixed, frankly, agreement or belief that mobility has a strategic role to play and should have a seat at the table. So I think leading organizations, the ones ahead of the curve, I think saw this trend coming, a few years ago, and started in many cases to combine mobility with their broader talent functions. And so those orgs were really joined up and planning together. I think in the lagging organizations, it's more of, hey, the rest of the business will decide who we need and where, and then we'll pick up the phone and call mobility so they can execute the operational components of the move. So that first hurdle in many cases for organizations is getting that buy-in and that understanding that mobility is here to stay. It can play a proactive role in helping evangelicize the sort of opportunity in a different location, and done right, it can help with retention and everything else. And then I think the second piece, if I'm honest, that's holding a lot of organizations back is the highly manual nature of a lot of the processes that are out there. You touched on it in one of your points earlier, but there's still an awful lot of Excel floating around.
Yeah, right.
And we're seeing some movement there, certainly, but it's tricky for folks that are already flat out and trying to deliver the operational pieces of mobility to lift their head up a bit and drive some of those strategic conversations when they're spending weeks on end getting ready for year end because the data is in 52 different spreadsheets and that sort of thing.
Right, absolutely. Thanks, Steve.
Hmm.
For this next question I'm going to ask you about, I'll start with you, Kristi. When you think about the last 10 years, how has global talent mobility changed? And as you've kind of talked through what's changed, what surprised you the most? I'll start with you, Kristi.
Well, I feel it's changed. I mean, just from my perspective, and this might be narrow, but that we have looked at it as we're sending U.S. expats everywhere to fill these jobs that we have overseas. And that was the way that we did it, right? And now what has changed for us is we're looking at it differently. We're like, okay, why are we doing that? We should look locally for the talent. Why didn't, that's kind of how we've evolved to, can we fill this position locally? And if we can, and some of our constraints are security clearance or import-export licensing. So that sometimes constrains us. But what we're looking at is if we can fill the position locally, that is where we're headed. And that has our biggest change. And because 10 years ago, we weren't very good at even knowing how to do that, how to pay people, what is the right pay locally, how to find people, things like that. So we have really grown leaps and bounds as a company ourselves. And I think that is a big surprise for me, just because of seeing where we were 10 years ago, or even before that when I first started with the company, where people in the U.S. didn't really know too much about those of us that were living overseas, even as expats. So,
Sure.
And also the other parts of mobility that have changed is the communications between all of the different agencies. Before, the immigration agency didn't talk to the tax agency. Not that they're all doing that now, but it's becoming more apparent to where you have to worry about things more than you used to from the
Sure.
compliance standpoint.
Oh,
Yeah.
Thanks, Kristi. Steve,
Yeah.
you founded Topia, so obviously you have been around this space and are in a unique position to talk about how things have changed in the last 10 years. So same question for you. What changes have you seen, and have there been any surprises?
Yeah, I think it's been a pretty wild last decade for sure. I think the if I had to pick sort of one thing for me, it's been the speed at which the definition of mobility, and I'll put that in air quotes, has expanded. So and that sort of I think ties a little bit into what Kristi was saying, but this if you go back 10 or 20 years, right, it was traditional long-term assignments, and that's what a mobility team owned. And I think over the last decade, we've seen this real acceleration to where many mobility teams I'm talking to are responsible for mobility related to cross-border hires, or campus hires even for some organizations, and increasingly business travel, high on everyone's agenda. Obviously, we're in a period now, a rare period of really no travel, but I think that will certainly pick back up. But that expanding almost remit and world of what global talent mobility really means has gone at sort of breakneck pace, and that's really, I think, put pressure and stress on teams and organizations to figure out, okay, well, the size of the population mobility needs to manage is now 3x or 5x, or if you factor in business travel, could be 10x or more. How are we going to deal with that, and what do we need to change to support that? So that's
Sure.
that's probably the big one for me.
So assignments really are from a few days all the way up to long term. Really, it runs the gamut.
Yeah, and I think we're really seeing it's that anything from a day to 10 years, right?
Yeah.
Where it used to be, hey, we'll talk to you if it's going to be a multi-year sort of thing. Yep.
Terrific. Thanks, Steve.
Mm.
Now, I talked about skill shortages. Chris, you talked about STEM talent. We've all seen the statistics around skill shortages and, the pending need to reskill hundreds of millions of people to fit the new work requirements. Given that, then we know we'll get back to that. Where does global talent mobility fit in with kind of facilitating that upskilling, cross-skilling, reskilling of the workforce? Steve, I'll ask you that first.
Yeah, I think mobility has a pretty powerful and unique role probably to play in the upskilling and reskilling arenas. And I think the piece beyond upskill and reskill in my mind also is redeploy. Right. So as the mix of skills changes, how that changes within one region or one country is likely to look very different, and the pace of change is going to be different around the globe. So I think what we'll see is mobility may have a role in either redeploying folks whose skills no longer fit in one region but actually are really needed in another, or also, and Kristi talked about it a little bit earlier, the talent development pipeline is a key one. So sending somebody on a short-term assignment for reskilling or upskilling, so that when they come back, they can bring some best practices, learnings, and be fit for the role they're returning to. I think we'll see a lot of mobility used in that arena, because it's only going to be increasing demand for new sets of skills and ways in which to deploy people.
Right. Absolutely. Well, Kristi, you talked about this already a little bit. You're starting with young people with scouting programs and so forth. But is there anything else that you are doing at Raytheon internally to try to tackle and get your arms around these impending STEM skill shortages?
Yeah, so some of the things that we are doing, and some of it's related to STEM, and some are some other of the other skills that we need. We have programs that we have a relaunch program for folks that have been out of the workforce for a period of time, and we help them by providing them the opportunity for bringing them back, developing them, providing them training, networking, and assisting them of re-entering the workforce. So we pay special attention to them in that aspect. We also have a transitioning military and military spouse program to help translate their skill, like the military skills, like for those that were out of the military or retired, to translate what they've done in the military into what we need as a company, because sometimes, it's two different languages. And so we help them translate what they did, that it's really the same thing that we need. So we have those programs. But another thing that we've done, globally, is we're looking at our job requirements, because sometimes we get stuck in, okay, you must have this specific, engineering degree, and that doesn't translate all over the world. So we're looking at, all right, what kind of experience do we need? And maybe that's the talent we need to look for, versus our US-centric view of, you need a bachelor of this specific engineering skill. We're looking at, okay, what experience in lieu of, what, skills, and what is the process in each different countries that result in the same talent, as an example on that. And then to touch back on our assignments, we do have a lot of people who, what we call, go on rotational assignments. So if we have a specific skill set, then that person or those people may go on an assignment for a few months in one country, and then go to another country and another country, and just kind of bounce around the world. So we have what we call as a rotational, multiple location types of assignments, so that we have that critical skill servicing many different regions of the world as well.
Wonderful. Yeah, I've actually heard quite a bit lately about job descriptions and making them more realistic, not just on a global basis, but recruiters sometimes, and I think I'm as guilty as any, will put out their requirements that are really not necessary to be excellent at the job. So I think that's an excellent point. Now, let's kind of turn the questions back to kind of the 4 areas of the maturity model that Steve was sharing with us earlier on, key pillars here. And let's start with operational efficiency. And, Kristi, from your perspective at Raytheon, how big of a priority is operational efficiency for your team, dealing with your clients, your employees and managers? Where do you see the main points of both opportunity and challenge in the operational efficiency space?
So this is highly important to us to be efficient, because we have to be fast and quick to get people overseas, because there's times that it's real life events that are happening and we have to get somebody over in a few days, as an example. So we can't be inefficient and have a lot of handoffs and take our time, as you know, for example. So we are really focused on streamlining, on looking at the best ways to be efficient from an end-to-end perspective. What can we do to decrease the handoffs? We've worked over the past few years to get rid of a lot of our manual processes, our duplicate entries, you know, like as you know, Steve said earlier, you know, going from numerous Excel spreadsheets, which I will say, you know, over 10 years ago, I was doing everything in Excel spreadsheets,
yeah, right.
and barely making it. I'll say, I mean, I did it, you know, calculating allowances and, you know, doing things, mail merge, stuff like that, and come a long way to where now I have something that, you know, not only provides workflow, automation and calculations, reporting, and also I don't have to duplicate, you know, initiating different vendors for relocation, immigration, things like that. That it's so important, and we're still even looking for more. Even having that is excellent, but we always are looking to make it even faster and better, because that is what our customers demand and what they need. They want things turned around ASAP, especially when it comes to talent. One of the things that my team provides for recruiting is we need to turn around, hey, what is this package going to be to work, you know, overseas on a long-term assignment in Romania, for example. We need to get that turned around and get that offer and the package in front of this candidate's face right away, get that accepted, because there's so many steps that they have to go through before they can actually start work in Romania. So we have to work fast, and it's really an important focus for us and our internal and external customers in this space.
Absolutely, yeah, and that begs the question around one of our other pillars here, compliance. You know, this is for Steve. You know, you're on top of this. You know, how are these shifting regulatory landscapes? Things are different from country to country. They're growing in sophistication with GDPR and other kinds of rules and regs that are coming on board. You know, how is this impacting immigration to tax? How are organizations able to do global business? You know, what role is that shifting regulatory landscape doing to compliance and so forth?
Yeah, no, it's a great one, and certainly a hot topic. I think, you know, and Kristi touched on this a little bit earlier as well. I think, you know, compliance oversight is at an all-time high globally, and you know, frankly, I think it's only gonna get worse. And you know, whether that's increasing residency audits for state tax in the U.S. to posted workers directive in the EU, and you know, interestingly, you know, significant increase in sharing of data between government agencies within one country or between governments. You know, everyone is looking to maximize, from a government perspective, you know, revenue from fines and penalties where they can, and you know, that's just increasing the burden on companies. It's no longer going to be good enough, frankly, to deal with issues retroactively. It's heading to a world of predictive compliance management and avoidance of issues before they happen. And you know, we're starting to see pieces of that come into place, whether it's immigration rules being embedded within travel booking systems as one simple example, or utilizing a variety of different data sources to track days in country. You know, there's a lot happening in this space, and I think it's only going to increase as the pressure from governments, you know, ramps up. So a hot topic, one, it takes a lot of time and energy, and given the vast amount of data in this space, I think one that organizations have to have, you know, some component of technology in place on this one to have a chance of staying ahead of the regulators in this space.
Right, Kristi, you talked just a moment ago about kind of, you know, building out that package for Romania. I mean, how have you and your team responded to this kind of shifting regulatory landscape we're facing right now?
Yeah, so it is challenging. It takes a lot of time, and I think that's the most difficult part of it, when you have to be quick to get people on the ground working, and you don't have the time to do the due diligence. We have different subject matter experts in our company, and as well as other vendors that help us with the legal, looking at the legal requirements, looking at local labor law, looking at, what sort of corporate tax or individual tax, immigration. There's times that we don't have an entity to sponsor the immigration or to pay the tax. So there's all of those complexities that we have to worry about and get set up before we have somebody show up. And a lot of times we're pushed to execute on a contract or a program before the timeline allows for us to get things set up. So we definitely feel that pressure and are trying to be more proactive on that, but it is difficult. And when you talk about the tax organizations and the immigration organizations, now that technology is talking to each other. On top of that, with the local countries talking to each other, to themselves, we also have the complexity of some of our government contracts with those audits on top of that. So we have, host country audits and government audits, so we have compliance coming to us in many different angles.
Right.
So,
Totally understand that.
We're trying to do better. Yeah, trying to do better, being more proactive, but a lot of times we find ourselves being reactive on those.
Yeah.
Lisa, sorry to jump in here. Just being cognizant of the time. We're getting close to the top of the hour. If it's okay, we've had a few questions come in, and I'd like to just jump us into audience Q&A, if that's all right. I know we had a few more questions planned, but when you get into the conversation, sometimes things take longer than expected. So if that's all right with our group here, I'd like to move into the Q&A. Is that okay, Lisa, Steve, Kristi?
Absolutely,
Yeah, sure.
Sean. We got caught up in our conversation.
Yeah, those things happen for sure. So I think I'd like to jump off with something that's been raised by a number of individuals here on the Q&A, and that's around the COVID. Obviously, it's top of mind for everyone. Steve, Kristi, perhaps maybe Kristi, you could respond first. So how is the coronavirus impacting mobility, and how do you think global talent mobility teams should and can respond to events like this and be prepared for them in the future?
Well, it definitely has had a significant impact for us in many different ways. Just from the fact, when it first started and, before the U.S. exploded like it has past week or two, when we had different restrictions, the challenge we had was in managing was not only the U.S. restrictions, was each individual country having their restrictions on who can enter. So I had some of the rotational folks, like I needed somebody to go from Japan to Israel, but Israel wasn't allowing somebody to come to their country from Japan, but they could come from the US at the time. So we had to really change where people were going. So we were like, okay, this person needs to go home to the US and then travel to Israel. Then that person went to Israel. By that time, now the U.S. isn't allowed to come to Israel. So we've had a lot of challenges with that. But as a company, we've responded with very aggressively and trying to get, the PPE equipment to our folks globally, trying to manage what to do all over the world, and also the United States with the, telecommuting. However, we do have operations that have to continue in person that can't be remote. So it's been a challenge. And as far as because I talk too much, and that's why we're at the end of the hour here, so I apologize. But as far as the future, I think all of this, we are taking lessons learned from this. I don't know how that's going to shape out in the future. I think all of us globally just really have just been reacting to it. I think we have come, I think the data of where people are and what to do when something like this happens, I think we'll be better at it, so that we won't have kind of the chaos of all the questions and people kind of getting nervous. I guess that's an easy word to say about it. And so we would have kind of our template of, okay, the next one, we've been through it once, and now we can help and know what to do the second time. And stock up on supplies before something like this happens again, so we're not running out. Because that's within the challenge, you know, we need to order face masks and sanitizer and things like that.
Yeah, and I think, you know, just to
operating.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that point, I think we've certainly seen, you know, I think you're right. There's a large set of lessons that I think as we come through the other side, eventually there'll be a bit of a step back and plan, you know, what do we need to change for the next one. I think it's been, you know, highlighted, I think, very clearly, folks that are on the fence about, you know, who owns data about where our employees are. Does that sit within mobility? Does that sit within business travel? Does it sit somewhere else? I think where that was a bit of amorphous floating ownership, I think we're seeing folks sort of paying the price for that, and in terms of the challenge of getting their arms around the truth and the reality. And so I certainly expect, you know, we're already seeing an uptick in broader conversation and interest around, okay, from a technology point of view, how do we get better information to the right people in a shorter time span so that everybody's working off of, you know, a single version of the truth. In a world where, you know, the regulations and borders are opening and closing, you know, on an hourly basis at the height of some of this, I think having a way to share that information quickly, readily, and avoid some of the confusion will be a big help for folks going forward for sure. But I think just maybe to answer the last question that I saw come in there, Sean, around the impact of this over the longer term on mobility. In some ways, it's probably a little bit too early to tell. I think in the short term, obviously, there's been a halt in physical movement pretty much everywhere, given the situation with borders. But at least so far, you know, what we're seeing is most organizations are seeing it as a delay, you know, and likely for a few months, rather than a cancellation in activity. Yes, I think at the margins we'll see some mobility not happening that would have otherwise happened, but I think for the most part, you know, assuming it's a sort of 3 to 6 month challenge, most of it sort of picks back up, and we may end up in a world with a big challenge of how do we manage this big spike of moves once borders start to open again. At least that would be certainly the best case outcome in many ways.
We're all hoping for that.
Yeah. Lisa, if you mind, can I have one question for you regarding some of the stats you presented?
Yes.
Do you think, you know, obviously this coronavirus, this COVID-19 is having a big impact on some of those stats that you mentioned. Do you think that we're starting to see those stats change, or do you anticipate that they'll rebound? You know, you've done a lot of research and thinking about these sort of things. How do you think it will impact kind of the global business landscape?
Right. And, you know, I shared some material from McKinsey and Finicont there. And I do think that those folks, as well as IDC, we're looking at our forecasts right now. And we do anticipate that there will be, you know, a temporary dip as we move through this. So some of those figures might actually be lower for those, you know, for 2021 and so forth. But as Steve said, I have every hope and expectation that then things will return to normal and spike back up. But on the short term, yes, I do think some of those numbers will be lower than perhaps what we thought they would have been when we projected a year ago.
Great, thanks for that insight.
Sure.
So we're now just past the top of the hour, and to be respectful of everyone's time, we are going to go ahead and wrap up our conversation here. I want to thank so much Lisa, Kristi, and Steve for joining us today, providing their insight and knowledge on these topics. I'm sure folks will have more questions, and please do feel free to email us at info@topia.com, and we will get answers for you if you have anything you'd like to discuss. And as Steve mentioned, you can download a complimentary copy of the IDC white paper that Lisa touched on at the start of our presentation. And to do that, you can just go to topia.com/GTMA. And there you can also take our global talent mobility assessment yourself, see where you stand in terms of being a reacting or leading organization with your global talent mobility function. Again, thanks everyone for joining us today, and we're going to go ahead and wrap up the call. I want to thank everyone and wish everyone, safety and health as they go through this journey together with these tough times for everyone. So thanks again.